Read the financial press today, and you will find a familiar headline. With its domestic economy slowing down, China is allegedly offloading its excess, cheap consumer goods and dumping them into African markets. This narrative centers on a specific economic fear. A wave of heavily subsidized foreign products arrives, undercuts local prices, and crushes domestic African businesses who cannot match those margins. However, the math from the UN Comtrade database, tracking sub-Saharan Africa between 2018 and 2023, tells a different story. This misunderstanding stems from a basic logical error, assuming that an increase in the total volume of imports is the same thing as an increase in destructive imports. To understand the actual economic relationship, we have to look past the aggregate dollar amounts and see what is sitting inside these containers arriving at African ports. From 2018 to 2023, Chinese exports to sub-Saharan Africa surged by $56.5 billion. Breaking that growth down, consumer goods grew by 62%, while capital goods spiked by 113%. Capital and intermediate goods together accounted for 64% of that total increase. Intermediate and capital goods represent the physical tools of industry, the components and heavy machinery used to build other products. The data shows that China is increasingly exporting the actual means of production to African economies. This shift suggests that the primary driver of the trade surge is a structural industrial reconfiguration, rather than a coordinated attempt to displace consumer markets. If this isn't a targeted strategy, why is China suddenly providing the continent with such affordable industrial machinery? The answer lies in the vent for surplus mechanism, a byproduct of China's own industrial policy. Chinese state-owned banks have provided cheap capital to sectors like steel and textiles, allowing them to expand beyond what the market would typically support. When domestic demand in China contracts, these factories face massive structural overcapacity. Because they must service their debt and maintain cash flow, they cannot simply stop their assembly lines. To survive, they export their excess industrial inventory globally at clearance prices. The influx of affordable machinery into Africa is a consequence of China's internal overcapacity crisis, rather than a deliberate economic weapon. These figures do not negate the impact of localized dumping. Specific African producers are still being undercut by subsidized consumer goods in certain sectors. However, since the marginal import is now increasingly a machine or an industrial component, the conversation has to change. We are moving past the simple displacement of local goods. The real question of China Shock 2.0 is whether African businesses will utilize these subsidized, cheap industrial inputs to scale their own manufacturing. By acquiring machinery at lower costs, African firms have an opportunity to raise their productivity, expand their domestic capacity, and eventually compete as exporters themselves. China's efforts to offload domestic overcapacity may be making the tools of production more accessible to African firms looking to build their own industrial base.